Hi, Steve. Thank you for allowing me to submit my lesson via video. There will be some parts where I will explain what I would be doing with the class versus actually teaching it through video because there would be class participation as well as a small group activity, kind of similar to my last lesson where I had a think, pair, share and got groups working together. So I read the book Classroom Management for Art, Music, and PE by Michael Linson, and I focused on some of the key ideas of creating a good classroom environment and creating a sound classroom management plan. So, to begin the lesson, I would remind students of what we discussed the previous lesson, which we really focused on the advantages and disadvantages of being a special classroom teacher and how this plays into leverage and influence. So, what I would want students to do, I would give them a couple minutes, just like we did last time in that Think, Pair, Share, just to remember what we had discussed, and then we would review as a class, and maybe I would write down a couple of those big key points on the board. So, what are those key advantages and what are those key disadvantages? The author believes that these advantages and disadvantages specifically give classroom teachers, whether it's an art teacher, a PE, or a music teacher, certain leverage and influence without even doing anything. And what I want students to recognize are the big advantages, which are a lot of students actually do look forward to coming to these classrooms because they're different. A lot of students see this as a little bit more of a stress-free environment versus some core academic classrooms, and they see it as a time where they can have fun. Some of these classes, students feel like they can be creative and do something different, and overall, it's just a break from the regular classroom. However, being a special classroom teacher, there are many disadvantages because while students have fun with these classes, a lot of the times they don't see them as seriously as they would with their core academic classes. So, this might be the time where they can joke around or mess around, and they don't see these types of classroom teachers as they do with their maybe math teacher or science teacher. So it can be difficult to be a special classroom teacher in regards to having that leverage and influence over students because even if you say, you're going to lose points, you might not get a good grade. A lot of these students are like, well, it's art, it's PE, I don't really care. So you have to really understand how students are coming into your class and what are they portraying as the influence that you have over them. And the author says that if you don't have this leverage over your students, you cannot create a sound classroom management plan. So, going into your environment, you need to know the mentality of these students. And going along with that, once you really know the advantages of your environment, you have to make sure that you are providing meaning for students. They have to see that there's some meaning in the learning that they're doing. If they don't see this meaning, they aren't going to take the class seriously and they're not going to take the teacher seriously. So every day, the teacher has to make sure that although people might not see these classes in the same way that they do with math or reading, these classes are still very, very important, and you have to be able to show the students why if you want to gain that influence over them. You also, as a special classroom teacher, cannot rely on coercion or consequences. If you are just strictly giving out punishments for students, you are going to lose their behavior very, very quickly, especially at the higher levels and even the younger levels too. You can't rely on you thinking that you're going to be able to control all of your students. And you definitely cannot control them through coercion and consequences. And there has to be something more. There has to be a reason why they are going to listen, why they don't want to reach the point where they're serving, where they're needing to serve certain punishments. And then finally, you have to show your passion. If you can't show students that you love what you're doing, they aren't going to love what they're doing. And this is probably one of the most important things that the author highlights because so many special classroom teachers and regular classroom teachers too so quickly lose the ability to demonstrate their passion because they are so worried about having their classroom management and keeping that control. So that usually is the first thing to go. So we have to make sure that we keep that part in our teaching. Next, this is where we left off on my first lesson. So we're going to talk more in depth about the relationships with students and teachers. The author really believes that this is a key aspect of creating a classroom management plan. And if you don't create relationships, your classroom management plan will be weak. And he also discusses relationships in a very different way than I believe that most people are used to hearing about relationships in the classroom. The author does believe that relationships affect the influence on, or it affects the influence on students. So, how students are going to behave and how they are going to function in your class is going to correlate with the relationship that you have with them. However, and I even know in my personal experience, I think we all think as teachers, we really want to know each student personally, and we want to know, did they have that football game this weekend? Did they go to that art show this weekend? We think that we have to know so much personally about them and that we have to create these deep relationships. However, the author rejects the personal approach. He says that sometimes this can turn off students where they almost might be, um, quote, just kind of weirded out by an adult being so interested in what they're doing. And some students just don't have those social capabilities yet to have an adult conversation and create that kind of close relationship with an adult. And we have to understand that some students might just not really want to talk to us. And they get nervous when they're talking to an adult. And they might want to talk with their friends instead. So we have to really think about not always saying that we are going to be really personal with all of our students. And instead, the relationships that the author thinks that we need to build, and he calls this his miracle strategy, is just through being pleasant and friendly every single day. So when students come in, you are that same friendly, pleasant person, and you're showing that demeanor day in and day out, no matter what the circumstances are, what has happened in your personal life. You are giving off this demeanor, and you are creating a calm environment in your classroom. If you can do that, students are going to like you, and relationships just happen. And we really have to focus on just being constant with that approach. And in turn, students will like you. And when students like their teachers, they tend to listen more. And then Linson really goes into depth with temperament and composure. He truly believes, along with his miracle strategy of just being friendly and pleasant to students rather than trying to really, really get to know them in depth, if you can create a stress-free environment, this is directly going to affect your students and how they behave in your class. He talks about how when teachers are very, very tense or stressed, this affects our students. It might come in signs of where students are moving constantly. So, like in a PE class, they might not be able to just sit down and listen. There might be constant movement. They're throwing balls. They're moving around. This can agitate students, or it can create excitability where students just want to go, 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 and the teacher is so stressed and trying to almost stop the excitability, but in turn, they're actually making it worse. So, to combat this, the author talks about the decide first method. And this is probably his biggest point in the book. And in this method, he talks about how a teacher is supposed to wake up every single morning and, quote, decide first. So the teacher is telling themselves that no matter what happens, they're staying calm throughout the day and they're not going to emotionally respond to anything. So if something bad happens, so if a student, let's say, breaks a rule and the teacher has to elicit a consequence, they aren't going to emotionally respond. So it's not going to come out in yelling or being mean to the student. They are going to stay calm, give out the punishment or the consequence that correlates with that rule in their behavior management plan or their classroom management plan, and that's it. And then once the rule and the consequence have been talked about and the consequence is given out, the teacher is still in that friendly and nice and pleasant demeanor, and there's no emotional response. And the big thing here is that if you can keep your composure, this will also affect your relationship with students. They will see that they can trust you and they will like you more, because any students that see a teacher kind of, pop their top off and totally lose it, a lot of the times they start looking at this teacher in a poor light. So if a teacher can really stay just, even keel and not give out those emotional responses, students are going to like you more and they're going to have confidence in you, and you are actually going to have the control of the classroom because you know that no matter what happens, you are going to have your classroom management plan and you don't have to get angry and upset over what occurs. So it's not anything that you need to react to in a negative way. If something happens, rules are broken all the time. That's all you have to tell yourself. Stay calm, and this will also help, um, just in turn, keeping your students calm too. And as the author said, let the classroom management plan do your dirty work. So a lot of the things we talked about leading up to this point have been discussing the teacher's temperament and creating these relationships. And then the next big point will be, what does that classroom management plan specifically look like? And before we head into there, I would just give the class a scenario, because I know when I first read this decide first method, I honestly thought there's just no way. I've been in classrooms where I've seen teachers, lose their cool and start screaming. And I've also been in a classroom where I've wanted to do that, and I might not have, but I definitely have gotten emotional with my responses. So, do we really think that the decide first method is possible and that we can wake up every morning, tell ourselves that no matter what we're going to do, we're going to stay calm and not have emotional reactions? Do we think that's possible, or do we think that's just it's human nature to respond emotionally? So I would give students a scenario. The scenario would be a PE example. I would talk about how one day you come into the gym and you have a large class of 45 students. Right away, you notice when you come in, there's two students specifically that seem like they are full of energy for the day and they're definitely not ready to listen. It's a volleyball unit. The students know your rules. They know the rule that they specifically cannot kick volleyballs or throw volleyballs across courts. But while the games are going on, you see those students starting to kick the volleyball back and forth to one another. You give them a warning at first to stop kicking it, and the students stop for a second. But right away, when you turn around and you're no longer looking at them, one student kicks the volleyball so hard that it hits another student in the head. How would you react? Is it possible to not react emotionally to this, to not yell at the student? Or is it really possible to go over to the student with no emotional reaction, give them their consequence, and move on from that? So I would have students share their ideas. I would do the same thing. I would want them to first discuss with a partner. So we would do a think, pair, share so they can really get out their own ideas. And after a couple minutes, we would share with the class and see they're, if they think the decide first method would work in this situation. And then we would move on to the last part of the lesson. So we would talk about how, those prior key things are things that we can do as teachers, and that really affects how we are portraying ourselves in the classroom. But now we have our classroom management plan, and this is really what holds together what is going on in the classroom that we will be in, whether it's the gym, a music room, or an art classroom. And regular classroom teachers can take this as well into their classrooms. So the author discusses how when you're creating a classroom management plan, you have to keep it simple. It really should be no longer than 3 simple rules. And those rules can be whatever you want, and you can adjust it to your classroom. One of the examples that he gives was listen and follow directions, raise your hand, and be nice. And he also works with elementary PE students. So keeping that in mind, these rules will probably look different for different ages. And then he said, with those 3 simple rules, you give 3 simple consequences. And these were his example consequences, which were warning, timeout, and then parents contacted. And again, each teacher can adjust them for what they feel fits best for their class. And overall, the stresses here are to keep it simple, but you have to stay consistent. So if a rule is broken, the student must pay for the rule being broken. So a consequence must be elicited. He talked about how there might be some times where multiple warnings are given out, but the more you veer from your classroom management plan, the more students are going to as well, and the expectations to listen just won't be there. So knowing how the classroom management plan should be structured, I'm going to have students get in groups of 3 to 4, or our classmates get in groups of 3 or 4, and they are going to discuss the 3 simple rules that they created and then 3 simple consequences that they want to create. And I would want them to decide one of the 3 classes they're teaching. And I know not all teachers in the class are special classroom teachers, but I would want them to decide whether they're going to be in a PE class, an art class, or a music class, and then what grade they're working with, and then design those rules and consequences specifically to that. I would give students maybe 5 minutes or so to create those with their group, and then when they're done, I'm going to have each group share what their rules and consequences are and give some reason for why they chose each one. And then after we share, this is pretty much where the lesson would wrap up. I would again review and stress the importance of creating relationships, knowing the kind of leverage and influence that you have going in your classroom, and then focusing on the decide first method. That is his key point, and that allows you to keep those relationships and keep your leverage and influence if you can stay calm, friendly, and pleasant, and stay consistent with how you are day in and day out. And then also understanding that you need to let your classroom management plan do the dirty work. Don't get emotional when kids break rules. They're going to break rules. Instead, let the classroom management plan be the bad guy, you be the good guy. And at that, we would end the class there, and that would be my lesson. Thank you so much.